And we are live. Yep.
Brilliant. Hi, welcome to Freedom's Anarchist News Review. Tonight we will be talking about gentrification in Peckham, the continuing harassment against pro-Palestine voices, the news on Ocalan and the call to disband the PKK, uh, the rearmament or remilitarisation of Europe, and the goings on in France and around the world in regards to Tesla. Joining me today, we have Simon from, well, also from Freedom. I am, of course, Sam from also from Freedom, the UK editor for from the news. Um, to start with, shall we start talking about uh, the protests in Peckham and gentrification?
Yeah, sounds good to me. Do you want
So yeah, of course, we've so the in Peckham we've had a number of protests against gentrification around all sorts of things. This is being, these ones are relatively new, but there's Peckham and gentrification has been kind of going on for quite a while now. These ones in particular have been around issues around housing and other such things. Um, yeah.
so the with this particular one, obviously there's a large demonstration gathered in Peckham Square on Saturday, um, and then moved down through Camberwell Green and Elephant and Castle, um, and was organised by the Southwark Housing and Planning Emergency Coalition uh, against gentrification. I mean, obviously this is a long-running, ongoing issue in London. Which has really had very little improvement over, and in fact has got considerably worse over the course of the last couple of decades. Um, Peckham, I seem to remember, as a Labour heartland.
Yes, and has been for quite a while.
So obviously protests against gentrification in Peckham have a particular note of, we're long-standing Labour loyalists. Why is this not improving in any way, shape, or form? The problem being, of course, that gentrification is not going to be solved by any of the measures which Starmer and co are proposing. Um, there's actually an interesting. One of the core writers of Freedom over the decades, obviously, has been Colin Ward. And for people who don't know, we are currently working on a new edition of his Housing and Anarchism, which we're quite excited to be bringing out. Colin Ward had a take on housing, which was sort of in some ways close to what Starmer and co have been projecting, which is strip back some of the planning blockages um, to allow people to build their own homes. But obviously, Colin Ward was taking it from a much more DIY community building projects perspective, as opposed to the way that Starmer is attempting it, which is just give developers free rein to do whatever the hell they like. Um,
Yeah, and this is, as you say, this has been, I mean, it's not just Peckham. We've seen this across, well, London and much of the UK, and it's been, the sort of the how, in fact, Europe, like, sort of housing is continuing to be a kind of, sort of huge issue, across the board, and sort of, the kind of the kind of government response to it sort of largely has just been to sort of, promise more and more, but without actually kind of ever really addressing, the kind of the issues that are, causing these issues to start with, which, has, yeah, been a big issue for a while.
Yeah, I mean so obviously there's a lot of different problems which help give rise to gentrification in places like Peckham. One of which is that the way that capital has tended to suck money and assets, sort of suck itself into sort of the most central position of the key cities of the world, also means that there is considerably higher competition in these bits of cities than you would find in, say, the north. Now, technically, across Britain, there are 700,000 empty, unused homes. And we also have some of the lowest density housing. So, in terms of the number of people per abode, we have some of the lowest numbers now of any point in our history. Um, and this is obviously slightly reflecting to some degree the atomization of society, the way in which families no longer all live in the same house, the way in which you get into your 20s and 30s and you're kind of moving out and then living in HMOs a lot of the time, but then looking for your own place, and all this kind of stuff. So there's changed requirements across society, but also changed geography for where people want to live. And when you're trying to address something like gentrification, it's no good taking it in a kind of, if we plonk a load of houses over here, then that'll solve the problem. Because the problem is not a housing shortage as such. It's not a shortage of bricks and mortar, rather. It's that you're demanding that everybody live in a certain place, um, and then asking them to then compete in a kind of zero-sum game to live in that place, whilst not giving them any support to do so, not building housing which is relevant to what their needs are, etc., etc., etc.
Yeah. Um, shall we move on to the?
Sure. So the next one being Tesla torchings in France, I believe.
Oh yes, which has been we've been still seeing a lot of these things happening since well, particularly since the election, but also before the election as well. So this most recent one being in France has seen I think it was it 8 cars burnt and a f bunch of others badly damaged. And this is sort of
I think we may have lost you
matched
there, Sam.
kind of actions we've seen in I think it's Germany, where the well, sorry,
Can you hear me? I think we may have a connection issue here.
can you hear me?
I can now, yeah. Yes. Sorry, Karen.
Oh, sorry. So I was saying in Germany you had the projection of uh, the uh, the projection on the side of the factory. And I think there's been other kind of arson attacks. And in America, there has been a sort of this sort of new trend of kind of graffitiing Teslas in the street. A lot of this obviously is very much kind of based on or kind of continues on from sort of the fallout of Musk's well, his fascist salute. Um, and
And not to mention quite a lot of other stuff as well.
and not yes, well, exactly. But I mean, there's also we were also sort of seeing kind of sort of not kind of quite as intense, but there was obviously Musk has been engaged in some labor disputes over the last couple of years, in particularly in Sweden, but also in Germany and other Northern European countries as well, which have seen some solidarity actions with that as well. Um, yeah, what do you think about
Yeah,
this?
it's an interesting one because there's a lot of stuff which dovetails in terms of Elon Musk suddenly coming under a lot of pressure. So obviously Tesla's value has dropped, 40% since the start of the year or something, which doesn't take it down to, I think it takes it down to a little above where it was in November, but not much. Um, and losing that money, sort of losing that value rather, impacts on a lot of his kind of back end fundraising and all that kind of stuff. Um, he is under pressure from trade unions in both Germany and I think Norway as well. He was
Whereas
having trouble,
Sweden, yeah,
maybe Sweden. Um,
Sweden.
and some of it is of his own making in terms of like, yeah, going to AFD and making a big song and dance. On the one hand, it'll make everybody in AFD love you, and on the other, it's going to be, what is this American dude doing coming in and trying to influence our elections? Like it's an incredibly for a guy who, in fact, for a guy from a tendency that stresses sovereign authority so strongly, it's really quite astonishing level of hypocrisy. I mean, obviously, Elon Musk is a totem pole raised to hypocrisy, but it's even for him, this whole thing of going to lots of different far right organizations across Europe and trying and offering to fund them and talking them up on Twitter, sorry, X, and generally sort of being highly supportive and attacking political movements, particularly on the left, obviously, but the liberals as well. It's fairly much guaranteed to stir up it's the what is it? Never start two fronts in a war, and Musk has started multiple. There's it's affected all kinds of aspects of his business, and obviously at the moment, Tesla is being artificially held up by a stock market that still believes, astonishingly, still believes things that he things that he tells it. So he's most recently said, "Oh, I'm going to be doing full AI driving," which he still hasn't demonstrated. Many years after he originally promised it. I'm going to be bringing out robots, and the robots were remote controlled by someone in the back room, and I'm going to be producing this all singing, all dancing Grok AI, which, as I understand it, the fourth one is pretty good, but it's also in amongst a fairly aggressively competitive field. There is absolutely no guarantee that he is stealing a march or cornering a market with it. And this idea that Tesla has has something like 10 times the value of Ford on book value of Ford, a company which produces something like 5 times the number of cars, is ludicrous. From the get-go, it's ludicrous. And I think the decline of Tesla is something which will probably accelerate along with a decline in the tech bro sphere. Um, and that may well attach to what we're seeing in terms of, just to loop it back, to what we're seeing in terms of uh, political activism against the tech sphere being on the rise. And it's not just against Musk either. There's kind of movements in Europe to divest um, from American tech generally. There's, sort of saying, well, stop using Google, stop using Facebook, stop using PayPal, all of these companies which um, Varoufakis has kind of characterized as the new techno feudalism. There is a liberal-led nationalism or patriotism of some kind, or possibly anti-Americanism, maybe just, um, which is starting to say, well, yeah, like why are we paying essentially an ongoing forever tithe to people who live in America and treat us like shit? And like you can say from an anarchist perspective, uh, your European billionaires are not going to treat you any better than the American ones, but it's going to spur that kind of thing does spur um, action, and it's the kind of action which, if we engage with it constructively, can have, I think, very useful outcomes.
It's it is kind of interesting. We do sort of we are sort of seeing this kind of rise of not just the authoritarian sort of right and stuff like that, but this sort of or not entrance, but like this sort of more overt involvement of kind of the business class in politics explicitly, sort of as shown by Elon Musk. It's the most obvious and sort of blatant example there. But like once again, all these people, like the way they got ahead, the way they built themselves up, it was it was all myth making, sort of lying on their sort of CVs about their capabilities, and sort of just flogging used cars to people. They are sort of salesmen, con men, and they can promise, they are, the way they get ahead is by promising, ridiculous things. And, that may, sort of pull people in to begin with, but like inevitably, the facade of, will fall. And as it begins to fall down around them, it's, inevitably people are going to be kind of angry, like, angry with, maybe they're angry because they were lied to, maybe they're angry because they bought into it and it's fallen away from them. But it's hard not to see. It's not sustainable, and it's kind of it's going to be very difficult to for them to sort of try and sort of maintain this and then bring it back to Tesla again. Elon Musk is someone who promises big, and he's got a lot further to sort of fall than quite a lot of the other people who are a bit more kind of canny when it comes to what they're promising.
Yeah, I mean, Musk is an interesting one because he has been sailing on genuine achievements by his company, and obviously, it's important to note that it is the scientists in his company that make
Mm,
these
absolutely.
advances, not him. But he has been canny enough to hire on clever people and to leverage his reputation in ways that have drawn in um, a really impressive coterie of inventive minds.
Mm,
That's just a thing that he has in his back pocket. That's a real, it's a real underpinning to the value of at least some of his company. But I think it's important to kind of tease out the differences between real achievements by his employees, which involve, the chopsticks, the world's largest rocket. Admittedly, it hasn't gotten to space properly yet without blowing up, but they've made clear progress. Um, the Tesla Originally, the Tesla cars were very advanced for what they were. They still have excellent batteries. Um, they are now being passed by other companies, particularly in China. I mean, Musk is currently trying to sell a $35,000 vehicle, which has an almost identical vehicle built in China being sold for 10,000. And obviously, that's a hiding into nothing for any company. Um, but there are real strengths for Tesla, but they're all bound up with we're going to be on Mars by 2016. I mean 2020, I mean 2030, right? Um, and all the tech pros do the same thing. Like people have already largely forgotten that Mark Zuckerberg sunk billions of dollars into VR headsets and
mm.
the next generation avatars, and we were all going to be constantly online via VR, and it never happened, right? But like you have to keep rolling on this is the big new thing. This is the thing which if you get in on the ground floor, you can be a billionaire, Rodney, this time next year.
Tying
Um,
it back to Peckham.
Tying back to Peckham, there you go, perfect. Um, but yeah, like I think there's been a rising level of dislike for the tech pros for quite a long time, and I think that it's also worth bearing in mind that it's you know I remember reading an article about Google buses sweeping into San Francisco in the mid 2000s, early 2010s, maybe, um, and people throwing rocks at the buses because this was a uh, it was essentially a colonizing presence, right? Like San Francisco was a city of normal human beings. The tech system kind of bought up all the housing, caused enormous gentrification by, outspending everybody else to buy these houses. The same as happens in Peckham, in fact. Um, and and left everybody else struggling, being pushed further and further out, and being left behind by an increasingly, away with the fairies tech class. Now, I think actually most of that tech class is in the process actually being proletarianized to a great extent. You can see obviously there is the technical proletariat element of it. They work for a wage, but very much in the you work for a wage that is so high that you are essentially moneyed enough to be a capitalist after a few years for quite a lot of them. Um, and certainly sort of lifted above the hoi polloi more generally. But they are being brought down to earth with the bump because, and Zuckerberg's been shedding jobs, Google's been shedding jobs, sorry, Alphabet rather has been shedding jobs. So has Tesla, so have various others. Peter Thiel's mob, Oracle, they chopped a bunch as well. Loads of gaming companies have been.
Yeah.
Um, and this is all part of them. They've gotten it into their heads that they no longer need to play nice, and they have the leverage to cut loads of jobs, which means that all of a sudden this sphere of industry, whilst being skilled, is not. There's not enough of us to go around. Therefore, you have to pay us a shed load of money. There's competition for jobs, which means it's going to drive the wage down, drive the hours up, the usual, essentially.
Well, indeed. Shall we move on to the next topic,
Yeah,
which
was it
is oop.
harassment of pro-Palestine voices? I've got written here.
Oh yes, that's the one. Yes. So that was based off particular this article about a Palestinian author in Canada um, who has been this is facing pressure from various people. But this is obviously very relevant because it kind of ties into sort of more local stuff here with the kind of ongoing voices being sort of silenced on universities in particular, but also sort of people in the street. There's been kind of quite a lot of controversy around the policing of Palestine demos and the way that that's been handled. Once again, sort of very much sort of focusing on the kind of the free speech element, which is important to think about. Um, as well as many other sort of voices who have been sort of facing kind of boycotts through sort of various sort of means. With there's been the obviously the BBC documentary being the most recent bit of kind of culture to be well censored, I guess, is the only way you can really sort of kind of think of
Yeah,
that
so
with
correct.
it. For those who don't know, there was a documentary which was filmed about the kind of humanitarian situation in Palestine, and it you know faced kind of calls for it to be pulled because it was focusing on Palestine. So there's a lot of kind of Israeli voices trying to sort of call for it to be pulled, and then you know after that, it then turned out that one of the children who was interviewed in it was the child of a minister in the administration in Gaza. I think it's like the agricultural minister's son or something like that, which the people who were already calling on it to be removed then jumped on and were like, haha, evidence that this is sort of being funded by Hamas or whatever it is they're claiming, even though it isn't evidence of that at all. Um, anyway, point is the BBC have now they put up a kind of warning beforehand, but they've now pulled it entirely. Um,
Yeah,
yeah.
it's the so with the story and freedom, obviously it's Yves Engler, a Canadian journalist who had been jailed in Montreal last sort of late last month, connected to a harassment case brought against him by a right-wing Twitter personality. And this has been, I think it's probably fair to say that the uh, whenever you get particularly strong stories in favor of the Palestinian cause, and particularly any campaigners, um, there has been a trend towards making vexatious accusations, and also of essentially, as with the BBC one, of drumming up a relatively minor point, which is, yeah, the I think was the 11-year-old kid,
11, 12, yeah,
um,
something like
11 or 12, was the son of a minister who had zero to do with the military aspect of it, and wasn't talking about the military aspect of it particularly. He was talking about how he lived, um, and not to say the sins of the father, because I don't know whether the father has done many sins, um, but like, when you've got a kid talking about his life, I suppose the most you would need to do there is just say, by the way, he's the son of, or whatever, and then people who wish to dismiss uh, what was quite obviously a fairly straightforward description of how he was living. It wasn't like he was wandering about, sort of
that.
um, making stuff up left, right, and centre. It was just, here is the thing, here is how I live. Um,
I mean, it's it's very demonstrative of the kind of the attitude of the kind of Israeli propaganda machine, in sort of completely blanketing all Palestinians with they're all all Palestinians are basically Hamas in as far as they're concerned. Any attempt to sort of separate sort of Hamas and the Palestinians is not good enough and will never go far enough. Like, if you are in favor of the Palestinians, you are in favor of Hamas, and that is the line, and it shall never be erred from. And there's no really kind of sort of arguing with that, because it's such a sort of entrenched sort of sort of position. But it does you know y- it leads to these sort of situations where people who should know better, like like in theory should know better. Obviously, we know better in that regards, that not to expect that. But like the BBC, the police, the sort of various sort of kind of entities, authorities, as it were, sort of kind of when they give in to this sort of this pressure, and they just end up it kind of looks absolutely ridiculous. And you do you know we can debate about sort of how far free speech really kind of goes in in Canada, the US, the UK, etc., and sort of stuff like that. But like the right to sort of expression, and sort of we do have basic kind of principles around this, and they're just so overtly being flaunted in order to sort of appease sort of this sort of this minority of voices, which is the Israeli propaganda machine.
well, I think it's also, I think it's always worth bearing in mind that, um, it's so with most of this stuff, it's actually not sort of Israelis, or even, um, sort of people sort of doing what they're told to do. A lot of the time, it's people do genuinely pick a side and run with it based on systemic factors, right? Like, the fact is that the British state has consistently taken a position of supporting Israel to the hilt, of denigrating people who march on the big pro-Palestine marches, of arresting Palestine activists for relatively lightweight stuff, and then sending them down for far longer than they should do. Um, and when you have that approach, uh, there is a subset of people who will basically just fall in with that approach, right? Like, if the media is already saying, um, like, if the BBC does a big uh, documentary, and the documentary is controversial, or the documentary is pro-Palestine rather, um, a lot of the media has already been running lots of articles saying anything pro-Palestine is uh, beyond the pale and should be shut down. and they will automatically react that way because they have done so before. This is a very common thing among the media in particular, but also among the general public because you get trained into thinking a certain way, um, and you respond that way every time, regardless of whether it actually makes any sense. Sometimes.
Yeah, there's definitely that kind of going on as well. But I don't, sort of, it's, I don't think we should also kind of overlook the fact that there is a kind of almost industrialized process of sort of stamping out any sort of sympathetic media as well going on there. But this is sort of kind of difficult to see how this is going to kind of get any better, get it better anytime soon as well. I don't know if you saw, I think it was this morning, sort of Donald Trump sort of saying that, sort of in the US, anyone who was involved in the pro-Palestinian, sort of stuff, is going to, face, if they're not from the US, face deportation, and if they are, then, sort of expulsion from kind of universities and stuff. It's this is a going back to that sort of totem of hypocrisy you were talking about earlier. The free speech brigade kind of coming in hard and fast to silence these voices.
Yeah. On which note, so we could probably move on to Ocalan's call to disband the PKK, and in the seemingly unilateral declaration of peace um, with uh, with Erdogan. Um,
Yeah, this is well, it's all interesting, obviously. That's why we're reporting on it. But this one, is I guess complicated is a better way of thinking about that. The situation, obviously, in the kind of Kurdistan has been sort of fighting for, or the Kurdish people have been fighting for independence in various shapes and forms for the best part of um, well, in this particular conflict, I guess 40 years. Um, and now this kind of coming along at a time when sort of particularly when sort of the situation in Syria, well, Syrian Kurdistan for sure is kind of very complicated. Sort of Erdogan is continuously sort of trying to sort of solidify his kind of control over the um, Turkish state as well. Um, it's yeah the I forgot where I was going with that.
right.
Long day. Um, yeah, the do you want to say something about
Sorry.
it while I try and
Yeah,
gather my
yeah,
thoughts there? Sorry,
yeah.
that was just
I,
completely kind of
I've had brain freezes before on these things. It's yeah, impossible. Like you need a second just to reset the brain when it happens, and um, so yeah, so just to kind of summarize, I guess what's been said by or has been reported by Blade Runner, one of our regular writers. In historic declaration, the imprisoned founder of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, Abdullah Ocalan, has called for the organization's disarmament and dissolution. And in response, the PKK's leaders have declared an immediate ceasefire, framing it as the start of a new historic process. Um, if Turkey does release him, it would mark the most significant shift in the Kurdish struggle in 4 decades and constitute a major step forward towards ending a conflict that has claimed more than 40,000 lives. Now, obviously, that last bit, I think we had a couple of people saying, "Well, not sure that's entirely true." Um, Obviously, there is at least a strong um, what's the word? Possibility that this is linked to Erdogan wanting to regain Kurdish support so that he can extend his time in power at the head of the Turkish government. uh, given how, as with so many of his type, um, these kind of autocratic heads of state, uh, he's doesn't strike me as a tremendously trustworthy or reliable person with promises such as these. Um, but it seems as though the PKK is taking it seriously in that sense.
Yes, and that's sorry that I remember where I was going now. It was because he, despite the PKK announcing this ceasefire, Erdogan, or the Turkish government anyway, does seem to have also not quite rejected it, but they've called on for more than just the PKK to disband, but they also want other entities that they see as being essentially part of the PKK, such as the YPG and the Syrian Kurdish militias, to disband as well. And that I think does kind to an extent sort of speak to the kind of unreliability of the Turkish particularly in this regard, because if they're not if they're not being very diplomatic about it, I guess would be a thing to say there, because they are if they are serious about kind of wanting to end sort of end the peace, you would have thought that they would sort of be focusing on sort of Turkish Kurdistan, but they're also sort of demanding dissolution of the kind of armed groups in areas which are part of the wider neo-Ottoman, that is the kind of project which neo-Ottomanists such as Erdogan see as being part of Greater Turkey, which is, as far I'm not entirely sure of the exact borders, but Aleppo is with it, which is within the current Syrian borders, is definitely one of those places. It also includes bits of Armenia and Georgia as well as I think the kind of the Greek islands, and obviously uh, the big island,
Yeah.
Cyprus, as well. So yeah, it's interesting that the kind of PKK are sort of are making this move. Presumably they know more about what's
It
going on
is, I
than we do,
mean,
but
we've had a comment also sort of saying it's difficult to understand how it's a step forward. And it is, looking at it from a cynical perspective of you can't trust, I mean, you can't trust governments as far as you can throw them generally, but certainly imperialist oriented governments, which, as you say, tend to have a greater border in mind. And Erdogan, who is a fundamentally pretty grim person.
mm,
Um, there's sometimes with this stuff, it's very difficult because without sort of having a voice on the inside of the organization, it's very difficult to say um, what the thinking is. But it's certainly in the case in Turkey that the PKK has been under a lot of pressure for a long time. Um, and, as with a lot of revolutionary and kind of rebel groupings, there's a tendency eventually to run out of steam, right? Like you see the same thing with FARC and with the IRA in Ireland. Um, and with the Basque separatists, it's very difficult to keep up the tempo of a violent rebellion against a intransigent state that just keeps renewing its armed forces every year while you lose key people year on year. Um,
yeah, I think that's kind of definitely got to be an element of it actually. I was reading something the other day about which sort of very much sort of was basically saying that the sort of over the last 20 years or so, I think it is, but the number of the amount of deaths of, members of the Turkish security forces, year on year is kind of going down, but the as is this, deaths overall are going down, but the comparatively the number of PK or alleged PKK members killed by the Turkish state, I should say, is sort of remaining relatively high by comparison. So it's it does from I guess from a kind of outside perspective does look like they're beginning to sort of slowly that war of attrition is taking it's going to be taking its toll there.
And obviously in Syria as well, you've got the issue of, I mean, essentially they have run low on options to a great degree, right? Like the US is clearly not going to be supporting them going forward,
Right.
um, or anyone else for that matter, from this, it seems. Um, and they're under pressure from both the Turkish government in the north and the new Syrian government in the west. And without solid support base, it's difficult to see how anything other than a slow grinding attrition to the point of collapse would be the long-term outcome there. Sad to
It's
say. Um,
I mean, I do wonder if it's, sort of based off the back of, the relative success of the kind of project in Rojava, sort of, whether the Turkish, the PKK leadership are sort of aiming towards, a sort of situation like with Wales, where, it's still, you've got the kind of the government in Ankara still oversees everything, but like, this is actually kind of whether or not the backroom talks really are sort of to push towards a sort of more kind of regional autonomy for the Kurds. It's, I mean, yeah, as you say, without having sort of someone who's on the inside, it's sort of difficult to say. But the timing of it, given everything else that's going on, is I guess noteworthy.
yeah. Certainly, there is a strategic case to be made for, again, avoiding two fronts, if you possibly can, I
Yes,
suppose. But it does strike me as a degree of faith which uh, requires a certain suspension of disbelief. Um,
well, indeed, yeah.
oh, there's a question of have the AANES responded? Um,
Not that I have seen, although I have not checked.
I'm not seeing anything on news sites. So if they have, it doesn't appear to have made its way to the
Not to the English.
mainstream internet. Um, cool. Okay, so which leads us on to another military. We've had a lot of military related stories today, which is European remilitarisation. What a charming topic that is.
I mean, this
Um,
just seems to be the way of everything, really, isn't it? We are, the Brave New World and all that. We're entering stormy waters, it seems.
Yeah, I mean so the baseline story of this is that alongside Britain's own 2.5% rising to 3% percentage of GDP pledge for increasing its own defence spending, the EU has unveiled an 800 billion euro plan. So that would be what 600 billion, 500 billion um, pound plan to rearm Europe, and this would be 150 billion in loans, uh, helping to provide urgent military support for Ukraine, um, and loosening quite importantly, actually, because this is something which has tended to avoid doing, loosening national debt ceilings to allow for the additional defence spending. Um, I mean, obviously, a lot of this is kind of has been very predictable ever since the US essentially just said you're on your own. It's obviously there is a strong element of being pushed towards rapid rearmament by the threat, real or no, of Russia moving on from Ukraine, from a victory in Ukraine with its extremely large army, its militarized economy, and saying, if we stop fighting people, our economy falls apart. What do we do now? And it invades someone else. Um, but I think from an anarchist perspective, the thing we're going to have to be very cognizant of is that that sort of money not only is economically transformative in a number of different ways. And I don't just mean in the obvious negative ones in terms of like there's going to be a shed load more weaponry about, and that makes war more likely. That being the sort of thing which anti-war campaigners will quite rightly go after. Um, but it probably will create a short-term boost to economic spending in general, and thus to headline GDP. Um, and that will have an impact on the politics of on European politics. Um, there's also the element of when you start to rapidly remilitarize in material terms, it will be followed by uh, obviously a cultural
Mm, yeah,
remilitarization as well. We've lived, certainly I have lived my entire life in a largely non-militaristic country. I was born in early 1980s, and by then, I think the only war which was even vaguely um, one which people might have to go to, as opposed to, signed up to become a soldier and then were sent for whatever overseas war, was the Falklands. That's the
yeah,
closest that that we've been in my lifetime to British soil being invaded. And obviously, the British soil bit there is said with tongue firmly in cheek, given how many thousands of miles away it happens to be from any UK mainland. But the reality is that if we start spending vast sums of money on defense, that will have to be justified by promoting a rise in patriotism, in
exactly.
commitment to that military spending continuing, to the impoverishment of other areas of the economy that it will produce. Like somewhere like Portsmouth building another warship is going to make Portsmouth a wealthier city, but it also means money won't go to already impoverished places which don't have military spending plans in place.
Yeah,
Um, so all of that justification is going to involve an awful lot more flag waving and telling people to go join the army, be a man, all this kind of stuff. And I think that we're going to have to uh, probably try and work out and get ahead of this. I would not be surprised if there was a dovetailing of toxic masculinity, on the basis, on the kind of Andrew Tate model, and the way that it's been kind of building in particularly young male society over the last 5, 10 years, with be the most macho you can be, right? Join the army, wear some fatigues, shoot a gun. Um,
it's definitely a very obvious kind of place to go. And if you're, and as society does, you know, rearm, militarize, as the word I was looking for. That we're very aware that the government we're aware that the government is very aware of the kind of problems facing around the threat represented by sort of extreme sort of misogyny and stuff like that. So I don't think you have to be all that cynical to sort of see that it makes a very obvious way of directing those people towards something that they might see as being a good use of their time. Although I think a lot of people would, kind of quite rightly sort of point out that that's not necessarily the best place for to send people like that. But then, on top of that as well, like as you're sort of saying, it's kind of interesting to sort of it'll be interesting to see, I guess, how this has an impact on the kind of the drift rightwards that we've been, or the drift towards the far right, I should say, and whether or not that does have an impact on it. Because if Labour continues to sort of take up the kind of or continue towards what it seems to be doing, taking up the role that the Conservative Party has sort of held, and if the Conservative Party sort of stays more or less where it's at, it's sort of is this going to sort of kind of be like a kind of release valve on the pressure that the kind of this sort of far right build up is doing, or is it going to sort of to make that worse? Is that's a kind of interesting kind of question to think
and
about.
the thing that worries me, or at least well, one of the several things related things that worries me, um, is that at the moment what we have in Britain in terms of street fascist presence is a mix of older and younger body boys. A lot of people who are in their 40s who kind of grown up with a bit of football hooliganism and all the rest of it, joined the EDL, um, and are now kind of the street wing of reform to a degree, I suppose, although obviously the Tommy Robinson fans aren't big fans of Farage a lot of the time. But if you take the younger generation of, uh, you know, poisonous misogyny and all the rest of it, and you put them through a very professional how to do violence training regimen, you suddenly have all of the makings of a paramilitary unit in Britain.
Yeah.
Like a proper one, not the kind of half-assed stuff that shows up on Tommy Robinson's demos, but like people who are trained and know what they're doing.
Well, this is actually, this is, I mean, historically, I'm talking about kind of, recent history, not, it's been very much a problem. There were members of groups like National Action, for example, had, sort of one or two of them had a military background, and in the States, even more so, the kind of the militia movement has, to a certain extent, a kind of, sort of its links to the US military there. So I think that's more than just a sort of, that's a very reasonable concern to have, and that's, should be, the army has always been a, if you're a sort of, one for sort of defending the borders and sort of harking back to kind of glorious battles of
Yeah,
the past and sort of stuff like that. There's a lot of people who like to sort of talk the talk, but this does offer a kind of an opportunity for the next generation to, at least attempt to sort of walk the walk a bit, which,
I mean, this has always been. I mean, as you said, there's always been an element of the armed forces, and is an element of the armed forces in every country, right? Like this has been
oh,
one
absolutely,
of,
yeah.
one of the big arguments, obviously, over the whole Ukraine-Russia war was the existence of the Azov Battalion, um, and the infiltration of Nazis at a high level within the Ukrainian militaries, as a result, partly of that battalion being brought into the broader army. It obviously an arguable case, and one which I don't think we need to get into right now because we're running on towards our hour at this point. Um, but yeah, I mean, like obviously when Corbyn was leader of the Labour Party, there was that infamous uh, shooting range incident where people had put a picture of Corbyn at the end of the shooting range and were shooting him as their training, right? Like, and that was very strongly connected to the fact that there is and always has been a strong far right presence in the UK Army. And attempt, the British Army has historically attempted to balance the fact that it's very easy to recruit fascists, but they are a destabilizing element that you want to be able to keep control of, right? So whenever someone is too far out of line, they will be ousted from the forces, right? Like if someone's just flat out being a fascist, they have historically been kicked out. Um, but the British Army has had a recruitment crisis for most of the last
Yes.
20 years,
Yeah.
and the recruitment crisis means that people are much more likely to just look the other way on this kind of stuff. You end up with a don't ask, don't tell if you're a Nazi situation. Um, and yes, it is relevant. So there's a comment. It is indeed relevant to understanding the PKK disbandment. Um, like it's very difficult to uh, avoid having a fascist element in any armed force which bases itself around
Yes.
national defense, essentially. And the British Army is already desperate enough to let in too many fascists. And, you know, the presumed big recruitment drive that they are going to be undertaking as a result of having lots of money to do so now, um, I can only see it bringing in a weighted number of fascists because they are not going to be looking too closely at it.
I think that's correct. I think it's also kind of to sort of not move it on slightly, but like sort of worth thinking of other ways in which sort of this recruitment drive will kind of impact society, wider society. There's always been this sort of undercurrent of the attempt to sort of recruit at a sort of younger level as well. But sort of in the past, in particular, you had sort of the army kind of going into schools and doing these sort of things like
I
that. It wouldn't
remember
it
it.
wouldn't
Yeah, yeah,
it,
yeah.
it wouldn't I wouldn't surprise me if we sort of saw an increase in that. And this is I think the kind of question arises like if you're sort of seeing this, you're going to see this mass movement towards sort of patriotism and nationalism, something that anarchists have historically been against, and something that elements of the left are also supposedly against, and other elements of the left are not so much against. But the kind of the question, but one of the attacks that the left has always faced is the accusation that they are treacherous and sort of seek to undermine the nation at any sort of point, especially sort of in a military sort of situation. The repression around and sort of the accusations of sort of treachery get thrown around a lot more. So there is that kind of question of like how does the left resist the encroaching militarism that is bound to sort of we're going to sort of see how do you do stuff like sort of protests the ability the sort of army turning up to schools and trying to turn children into cannon fodder, like how do you protest that in a way that doesn't offend the sensibilities of good patriotic Britons? These are all things that we're
I
going to have to
mean,
start thinking about.
especially because it's all going to be couched in terms of defense.
Absolutely.
It's not. It may end up in a war of aggression, but the whole phrasing is going to be,
Defense
we
against
need to defend
Russian
defend our
aggression.
border against Russian aggression. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. On which note, that was a particularly long one and has taken us almost dead up to our hour for the meeting, which is quite long enough. A quick housekeeping. We are bringing out our next journal, or we are in the process of bringing out our next journal. So, for those who don't know, we bring out a uh, biannual journal, a 20-page free journal, in which we run a selection of essays, usually themed. And I've forgotten what the theme is for this year. Uh,
It was something along the lines of when sort of protests did well or something like that, or successful protests,
Successful protest
successful
sounds
resistance, something along those lines.
sounds about right. Um,
It's on my phone. I left my phone in the other room.
yeah, it's also it's on the website as well. In fact, I can look it up.
Oh, that's a good point.
Um, yeah, it is. I should have been more professional about this. But we're trying not to do that. Here we go. Our power is the title theme, and fascism is growing rapidly, and the state looms large as a hostile power. It's easy to forget that we are more powerful in potential. In the next print of Freedom, we would like to foreground your stories about times you or your movement has felt powerful. How have you made things happen or stopped things happening? What kinds of collective power have you mobilized for your achievements? How did you successfully deal with being opposed by the power of the state or other authoritarian forces like corporations? And what help can your story offer people who feel powerless right now? Please send your submissions between 800 or 1600 words to editor@freedompress.org.uk by the 1st of April. And we do like to emphasize that Freedom is an open publication which does welcome writing as long as it's anarchist related from basically anybody. Um,
Mm. Can I maybe do a little a request for an article? Um,
sure.
I believe this year is the 30th anniversary of the live export demos, which is a subject that I'm vaguely interested in, but there's not a lot of information out there. So if anyone knows anyone who might be interested in putting together an article talking about the 30th anniversary of the live export demonstrations, um, that would be very interesting, I think, and more or less on point, on topic with demos, successful resistance.
Sounds good to me. Yeah, I'm also potentially going to be working through an interview with the Anarchist Federation. This is an early one, which we're kind of starting on because they are celebrating their 30th anniversary this year, which for any Anarchist Federation is an impressive achievement, generally speaking. um, so that's obviously a good one to look out for as well. There's a few other bits as well which we have coming up. Obviously, there is Housing and Anarchism, which I think we mentioned earlier as our upcoming book at some point this year. We have now launched Physical Resistance, being shown off by Sam in his background. And there are going to be talks related to that happening over the course of the year as well. Keep an eye out for those. And obviously keep an eye on the Freedom Press website and our socials, all of which will be on the notes under this video to see what we are getting up to. Right. Have we got any other bits and pieces, or are we all good to go?
I think that's everything for me.
Oh, well, it's good night from me and good night.